Hello and welcome to Mullen's Benefits Companion, a podcast that helps employers navigate the complex legal challenges of managing their employee benefit plans. I'm your host, Brydon DeWitt, and today we'll have one of our crossover episodes focusing on employment law matters. I'm joined by a new guest to our podcast, my colleague Matt Anderson, an attorney in Mullen's Labor, Employment, and Immigration section. Thanks for stopping by the Benefits Companion, Matt.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Matt, work flexibility, especially in the aftermath of COVID, is a really hot topic for our listeners. And I know that you've been helping address important compliance considerations for employers who are offering more flexibility and remote work options for their employees. What are some of the key considerations and questions that employers face with this new focus on work flexibility?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you hit it right on the head with COVID. Kind of opened our eyes to all the different possibilities of when and where work can be done. Each employer is different. And so there's no one size fits all right answer for workplace flexibility. Each employer is going to have to ask themselves a few key questions. The first and most important, obviously, is can your employees successfully work remotely? Obviously, folks like us who are lawyers, we can take our laptop and draft briefs and email clients from pretty much anywhere in the world as long as we have an internet connection. But a teacher is going to be hard to teach first grade from the comfort of their couch. So, that's obviously the main consideration. Can your employees successfully work remotely? The next question is going to be, do we have the technology to make flexible or remote work a long-term solution? I imagine if you're answering yes for the first question, a lot of employers have already answered yes to the second question with what we've been through the last 2+ years. The last question is more of kind of a touchy-feely question of, how does this flexibility affect things like morale, camaraderie, and employee buy-in? Are employees going to appreciate having that flexibility, or are they going to kind of go off into their own bubbles and that kind of interwoven, dynamic workplace where, you're interacting with your colleagues daily on a face-to-face basis? Is that going to kind of go away and kind of make work a little more isolating and therefore not as fun, not as enjoyable as it can be?
So. Right. And I think, and we've seen it here with new people who come on board. How do you get them integrated into the culture of your workplace, getting new people trained? Those are factors as well. I mean, maybe when you went out on COVID, everybody was familiar with each other and could work well. But as we bring on new people, that's an issue. As you're saying, kind of the culture, the workplace culture is impacted by the remote work.
Yeah, absolutely. And as someone who came on kind of here at the tail end of the restrictions, to this firm, it has been a little fits and starts as far as getting integrated into the culture. So it certainly having, the more flexible workplace arrangement does, interact with that to a certain extent. And each employer is going to have to ask themselves how much do they want that to affect their workplace.
So I guess, in part of the culture also is employees understanding that the same rules apply to everyone.
Right.
So do you recommend having policies and procedures, formal policies?
Absolutely. As with all good employment policies, you want to have a clear written policy regarding remote work. And there's a number of questions that policy needs to answer. First is, when is it acceptable for an employee to work remotely? Is it always? Is it only on certain days? Is there some sort of, work from home day allotment similar to, a sick day or a vacation day? Are there days when the employee must be there? Does your workplace have a weekly meeting that all employees need to be at? Or, is it more of a workplace where the work can be done remotely and you trust your employees to kind of make the right decision on when is appropriate? But regardless of where you land on that, it's best to put it in writing what your expectations are. That way, there's no question if it ever becomes an issue. The next question that the policy needs to answer is, What reasons does an employee need to give to be allowed to work remotely? Is it, again, a situation where you trust your employees to judgment, or are you going to have some kind of defined parameters that say, hey, remote work is acceptable, when you have X, Y, and Z? So you got to answer that question. Next question is, how does the permission structure work? Or does the employee even need permission? So do you need to contact your supervisor? Do you need to contact HR? Does permission need to be in writing? And that, we've kind of already touched on the next question is, how does the employee provide notice of when they are working remotely? So you could have a policy that says, hey, you can work remotely whenever you want for whatever reason you want, but you're going to want to have the ability, you're going to want to know when and where an employee is, and setting up a chain of notification, kind of a chain of command for each employee of, hey, you need to tell your supervisor, or you need to tell a certain person in human resources about when you're working remotely. That way, the employer can keep track of who's working remotely, where they are. You don't have someone, your boss coming into the office looking for you and not know, hey, Jim's working from home today. So providing that notice is really important. And then lastly, your policy needs to set out when the employer can say, no, you cannot work remotely. Is it tied to productivity? Is it tied to certain occasions around the calendar? Are you in a business where your calendar, means a lot, and so you need employees there on certain days, and other days they can work from home, particularly in something more seasonal, like you say accounting, where tax season things get kind of ramped up, and you need kind of all hands on deck. And then after tax season's over, it's a little more relaxed. But the employer is going to want and need the ability to kind of nip it in the bud if remote work becomes a problem.
Yeah, and I think this is so important from we were talking about culture. If employees know that everybody's being treated the same way, or if the employer can point to an established policy for why a certain person got to work from home on certain days and why other people have to come back to the office. And then probably there's, from a discrimination standpoint, you need to make sure that everybody's being treated the same under a written policy. So I agree. I think that's really important to have a written policy. Would that be part of the employee handbook, or would it be a separate policy, or does it matter?
It really depends. You can certainly have a separate policy, or you can just incorporate it into your next revision of your employee handbook.
All right.
And you hit the nail on the head with the reasons why you need to have that consistent policy is that, you need to be able to say, this is why someone can, this is why someone isn't, if a discrimination issue comes up, you want to be able to say, here's kind of the blanket rules and we apply them equally, and your situation checks all the boxes and this person's situation doesn't. And that's why you can work remotely and they can't.
Right.
And it's not for any reason other than, what's written in the policy, not because of any sort of discriminatory animus or anything like that.
So we had seen an explosion in technology, or maybe it was already there. We didn't know about it. But during COVID, I've noticed a lot of, calls with clients that would have been conference calls are now on Zoom or MS Teams. Mm-hmm. And so there really has been an explosion of technology. I mean, how do employers incorporate that into their remote work considerations?
Yeah. So that burst of technology we saw since 2020 and kind of before, I know there were some workplaces already using Teams or Slack as another popular one pretty regularly leading up into the pandemic, but kind of they became much more mainstream, much more well-known once we hit 2020. And so a great thing to consider is, how are you going to leverage these tools that we now have, this Zoom, Teams, Slack, Google Hangouts, GoToMeeting, WebEx, Skype to the extent people still use that. How are you going to use these new applications, this technology to assist with your workplace flexibility? Again, we're going to go back to policies. Now, a lot of employers already have a bunch of policies in place that are going to help with these new technologies. And you may have to adjust, expand these policies, but you're going to want to have things in place that are going to guide your employees on kind of the appropriate use of Teams, of Slack, of WebEx, of Zoom, and some of the policies that employers already have in place that can kind of wrap their arms around these technologies are anti-harassment policies, acceptable use policies, just making sure that it's clear from on their face that those policies would apply to interactions and the use of this technology. Communication through Teams should be treated the exact same way as all other workplace communication, emails, calls, whatnot. So you can't have one employee harassing another employee. And then on the flip side, if you're using these technologies to interact with clients or customers, you're going to want to make sure that your employees know, hey, by using this channel, you're officially representing the company, and you need to be just as diligent and respectful of the company as you would any other email with the client, a call with the client, that sort of thing. And in the situation where employees are using these technologies to interface with clients, you're going to want to make sure your employees know clearly, when can I use these applications? When is a meeting on Zoom okay versus a meeting in person? And what is the procedure for setting up a Zoom meeting with a client? Can you just do it on your own, or does the employer have a booking process, for lack of a better term?
It's really expanding the workplace. So before remote work, you had a place of business and you knew where that place of business was. But now you could have employees working for a company in Virginia who are residing in California. So how does that, what considerations do employers need to have about that possibility?
Yeah, so that's really the trickiest part of the remote work is you now have companies that thought, hey, I have an office here in Richmond, and that's the only place I have an office, and my employees drive into work every day. And now, some of them don't. Some of them live in California. And let me tell you, the laws in California that apply to employees and employers are a bit different from the ones in Virginia. And so working in different states and localities can trigger all sorts of different laws that employers just never had to deal with before. And these include obvious things, like worker protection laws, like what's the minimum wage? Does the state have any sort of paid leave law? Becoming more and more popular. Maryland became the 9th state to enact some sort of paid family leave. What is the definition of overtime? For example, under the federal law, overtime is any hour worked over 40 hours. Well, in California, they have an added layer of protection for workers of 40 hours, and not only the 40 hours in a week, but the 8 hours a day. So you could still work 40 hours in the week and still get overtime in California if you worked 10 hours one day and 6 hours the next day. And so you got to be cognizant of these worker protection laws, but there are also other laws like tax laws and business licenses that you might need by having employees in the state. I know if you have a remote worker in California, you're looking to pay into their various different worker funds that are funded by payroll deductions that they have. You need to be very cognizant of, if an employee is going to be entirely remote, you need to make sure that you're complying with the state, where that employee is sitting while they are actually doing the work for you, and that you're complying with all the various laws. And it becomes even more complicated if you have an employee who decides, hey, I'm going to go live in Germany. So now you're looking at, okay, now there's an immigration piece to it. You're going to have to comply with German immigration laws and get that employee a visa because they are working in Germany, albeit it's for a company here in Virginia, but there's still going to be some, workplace immigration issues that are going to crop up.
This could be a threshold question for employers who are considering whether to permit remote work and whether to hire certain employees with the understanding that they would work remotely. Is does the employer have the capacity to grapple with all of these numerous state and local laws and regulations that they would have to comply with?
Right.
They may not even know which states and localities they will have to comply with until they hire the employee or the employee moves. So that's, for some employers, that could be just a threshold question as to whether to allow remote work in the first place.
Absolutely. And it's going to require a lot of diligence, to make sure that the employees are keeping their information up to date if they move. I would imagine there are some employers, that take Virginia, for example, folks in Northern Virginia, before the explosion in work flexibility, they had their office in, Tyson's Corner, and they may have had employees that traveled in from just on the other side of the border in Maryland, who are now working remotely in Maryland, and all of a sudden they're triggering Maryland law. It can be something as small of a distance as that, or being an employer in Seattle and employing someone in Miami at a distance that's that great. And so you got to remain diligent and take into consideration what sort of laws you may be triggering by having an employee work remotely.
And also with remote work, there's a lot of confidential information being shared through the internet, through Zoom calls, through email, that's probably raises more IT security concerns than you would have if everybody was in the office.
Absolutely.
And there was a case just a couple of years ago where the HR personnel, they were working remotely, and the person was using their AOL account to send 401k plan distribution forms, and she was hacked. And the hackers got the forms and ended up emptying a participant's 401k account. And it's because it was unsecured. The communication method being used by a person working remotely for the company, the email wasn't secured. And I always think of that, and we think how with the explosion of remote work and flexible work, that the opportunities for hackers are there.
Yeah. Your home Wi-Fi router is a lot less secure than the one in your office. And there are certainly a number of instances where bad actors have gotten into employer systems through remote work. And so network and IT security is a huge, huge consideration for remote work. And it comes down to, for some employers, it's just going to be, can your network handle that increase in volume of information coming in from outside of the building? You're exactly right. You got to assess what threats does remote work pose to cybersecurity. A lot of employers are going to VPNs, which are certainly helpful because that's going to help encrypt the data that's going over your home Wi-Fi and your home router and out into the world. Something as simple as a VPN is certainly going to help. Another question that employers need to ask is, what devices can employees use to access the network? A lot of employers provide a laptop, and that's presumably secure, but I've worked in places where I could open my home computer and access client information and workplace files. And so making sure that the devices that you allow to connect to your network have the appropriate security measures in place. And so working with your IT, whether that's in-house or a third-party IT contractor, to kind of figure out where are security weak points, how do we need to address having people work remotely is certainly the best practice. And then there are basic policies that an employer can put in place that'll help increase network security. I mentioned before, only allowing approved devices, requiring two-factor authentication, accessing the network, and using authenticating apps like the Microsoft Authenticator or Duo, I believe, is another good one. And then obviously periodic cybersecurity training, always keeping your employees aware of what are the newest developments, how are these hackers attacking these systems, what do you need to be mindful of, that sort of thing is certainly going to help increase your protection, whether your employees are working remotely or not, honestly.
Yeah, those are really excellent points. And well, Matt, thank you so much for coming on to the Benefits Companion.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
That will wrap up our discussion on flexible work and remote work. If listeners have any questions or suggestions for future episodes of this podcast, please contact me. You can also visit our employee benefits page at williamsmullen.com/employee benefits. There you can find out more about our team as well as past episodes of this podcast and legal alerts. And finally, be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified when our next episode posts. Thanks for listening.